is up, everybody? Thank you for tuning in to episode 4 of Faux Football. This is the very real podcast about everyone's favorite fake sport, fantasy football. I'm your host, Chew. You can follow me on Twitter at FatherDynasty and check out the website, FatherDynasty.com, where you can find the articles with my Substack, this podcast, unless you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, what have you. And there's also a link to my rankings, which are over at Fantasy Pros, but you can find those over at the website, FatherDynasty.com. Very excited to be talking to you today. We have 2 weeks behind us. We have week 3 ahead of us, and this one's actually being recorded on Thursday before Thursday Night Football. I usually record on Fridays, so this will also be without the hindsight of how Thursday Night Football shook out. But we're talking about Band-Aids, and that would be the injured players that are stepping in for some of these studs, or at least partial studs, that we've lost thus far. Of course, flex and bust out, and that is looking at a couple of flex-worthy players, certainly with injuries mounting and depth charts getting shaken up. That will be very valuable at this point. And, of course, this or that, a little bit of sit-start advice, or 2 players that you may very much start, but one that may end up outperforming the other. So, with that being said, let's get to the Band-Aids. Well, we're only 2 weeks into the season, and our fantasy teams are likely already riddled with injuries, a little bit like D from It's Always Sunny. Our teams just have bones like glass. And going through each of the positions, kind of noting a couple of the bigger names, are the names that are probably most impactful to our fantasy lineups. Quarterback, we've already got a couple at this point. Joe Burrow, of course, probably one of the bigger names here, and of course, most significant of injuries, as he has a very bad turf toe that's going to be keeping him out for months at this point. They're hoping he'll be back by the end of the regular season, from what I last saw. But the end of the regular season for the NFL, it kind of depends on how close we're talking. If, of course, he's making it back to week 17 or 18 or something, what does that really mean for us for our fantasy playoffs and stuff? And how much could we trust him if he's actually making it back for the actual fantasy championship? And filling in for him while he's out, Jake Browning, someone who has filled in for him before when Burrow had a extended absence, if you will, and did reasonably well. I mean, considering you're going from Burrow to any other quarterback that's a backup, I think that's a reasonable expectation. Helpful for Browning that he does have 2 tremendous weapons in Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Surrounded by Chase Brown, a couple other good players as well, but a bit of the problem is the offensive line not tremendous in Cincinnati, but the hope would be that Jake Browning is kind of more working within the offense and maybe not trying to create as much, something that Joe Burrow is pretty good at, but does extend the play and does kind of open himself up to more possible hits and kind of cause more stress on the offensive line. So Jake Browning, someone who is, if you don't have Burrow at this point and your other backup options are pretty sparse, Browning was likely leading your waiver wires this week in terms of the quarterback going off there. The next one, which is a bit of a head-scratcher, J.J. McCarthy, the essentially rookie quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings. He is out with an ankle injury, and, finished the game, seemingly was fine. Carson Wentz is stepping in. Very funny to see this whole thing play out, not in McCarthy's injury, but this was right before the beginning of the season. Sam Howell was the backup for the Vikings, and then there was a bit of a switcheroo with Sam Howell being traded away, Carson Wentz, the veteran, being signed as the backup in Minnesota. So interesting that this has already played out to where they did that little switcheroo, and then after 2 weeks of the season, Wentz is ultimately starting. Now, how long that's going to be, I don't necessarily know. I think this is a tremendous upgrade for all of the weapons in Minnesota, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing Wentz. I think he's going to be a top 24 quarterback, barring a very, very tremendously difficult defense. I know that they've had a little bit of injury on the Minnesota offensive line. Of course, Jordan Addison has been out. Well, not necessarily because he would rather be out. He's not injured or anything like that. He had been suspended. But I think that Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, of course, is going to be getting a tremendous upgrade. And we'll talk about another Viking who is out and what that means for the rest of the supporting cast there. The next one is Jaden Daniels. Of course, Marcus Mariota is his backup. I think helpful that Mariota, no one, or very few, I guess you could say, are even going to be close to Jaden Daniels of what he offers. But Mariota, I think the helpful thing going from Daniels to Mariota is the play style and maybe the ability of how Mariota throws, not quite as good of a deep ball as Daniels, but again, certainly serviceable, and Mariota very mobile. So I think you don't necessarily have to change up the offense tremendously, and we've seen Mariota fill in a little bit for Daniels and has done well. So the hope is that Daniels is able to go, but of course this is a little early in the week. I think the hope was going to be that he was going to be practicing on Friday, and then they maybe go from there. But just be on the lookout for that. Certainly would be a good bye week fill-in if you need to stream him. But again, I think you probably would rather look elsewhere than Mariota. And we have two more quarterbacks here. The other one is Justin Fields for the New York Jets. Of course, Tyrod Taylor will be the veteran stepping in for him. Fields is at least missing this game with a concussion. And, you know, Taylor certainly has, certainly coming into the league, good mobility, very good passer, and again, played for a number of teams at this point. So a savvy veteran, a good backup to have. I'm not tremendously excited to start him. I do actually have one league that I'm going to be starting him in a pinch because sincerely, there's really not much else at all. Missed out on Browning and that sort of thing. But otherwise, I mean, not someone you're going like kind of seeking out to get, but again, someone who I think can definitely have a double-digit fantasy performance. I don't think he's going to get you into that 20-point range. Again, at this point, to get a backup to get into that range is unlikely and certainly maybe not predictable necessarily, albeit I do think it's possible with Carson Wentz this week. And last but not least, we have Brock Purdy. There was talks that they were going to try and get him to play in Week 3. Of course, Mac Jones filled in admirably last week, and that was without George Kittle and a number of other weapons. And the hope would be now that regardless of who's playing, that the Christian McCaffrey is in fact healthy. He, of course, is questionable with a calf. And Ricky Pearsall, supposedly healthy. Juwan Jennings, questionable, but I think should be playing. So a lot of injury news there over in San Francisco. I think a lot of it maybe is precautionary. And even if you don't have Brock Purdy, Mac Jones filled in well, and I think he could, if he's tasked with being the starter again this week, he's someone who I started in Week 2 on a couple of spots because I had to. And it turned out perfectly fine. So I think he could turn in another at least, mid to high teens performance in that 49ers offense. Jumping over to the running backs, though, as I mentioned with Minnesota, you got Aaron Jones going to the IR. That, of course, elevates Jordan Mason to the starting running back. Very exciting for all those people who were hedging the bets when the Vikings got Mason from the 49ers and were basically waiting for Aaron Jones to go down, considering his more recent injury history and of course, a bit of an older running back. So Jordan Mason, of course, elevated. I highly doubt that he was not already on a roster in any of the leagues that you all would be playing in. He was a pretty high-end handcuff or someone who's really a 1B in that offense and already had a decent role. The next one's up there behind Mason would be Xavier Scott, I think third-year running back, undrafted running back, however. But second year in Minnesota, hasn't really got much opportunity, but I think had a bit of a flash in the preseason. But again, even if they're trying to split duties a little bit, I think it's still going to be a lion's share going to Mason. Next up, Austin Eckler going down for the season with an Achilles injury. Of course, at his age, tough to see that. Of course, you have Corey Krosky-Merritt expected to step up. You have Jeremy McNichols, who is also actually questionable at the moment. I think he's still going to play. But McNichols would likely be the one that fills the Eckler type of role in terms of third down back. But then you want to look to see, is Chris Rodriguez no longer going to be a healthy scratch? What is this backfield going to look like? I have to believe that it's going to be Corey Krosky-Merritt or Bill as the 1A, the rushing element. But the unfortunate piece of that is that he is not much of a threat in the pass game. So I think that would kind of show the Commanders' hand from an offensive perspective. And a couple of other names that it's some questionable ones that I think should still play, but I think it's interesting to think of their counterparts and what that could mean. Christian McCaffrey, as I mentioned, I do think he's going to play. I think they've just, as they indicate, had shown in Week 1, being ultra protective of him and his injury compared to thinking of what happened last year. Of course, Brian Robinson, having been traded from the Commanders over to there, certainly a name that you should have, as many people seem to be waiting on Christian McCaffrey's health downfall. myself excluded on that one. And Tyrone Tracy for the New York Giants, questionable. Believe should still play, but Cam Scatabo took certainly an elevated role in week 2. I think that could very well continue. We saw a bit of that college magic from Scatabo in week 2, and I think that could continue. Real bummer. I thought Tracy could, hold on to that role a bit longer and a bit more definitively, but that might not be the case. And last but not least, DeAndre Swift, Chicago Bears running back. You have Kyle Monangai as the rookie backup. Roschon Johnson was, I believe he was healthy and was active last week. He may have been a healthy scratch. But Monangai had his snap share increase dramatically in week 2. And I do think Swift, even if healthy, I think Monangai is a worthwhile play. I'll talk about him a little bit later as well. And wide receiver, got Jaden Reed. He's already been out with the broken collarbone, of course. But I'll talk about one more player after this. That was a very recent addition to this list. Behind Jaden Reed, in the Packers offense, we talk about, do they really have a wide receiver 1? Is it just a team of 2s and 3s? Regardless of how you think about that, I think the one to kind of own there is Romeo Doubs. I think he did score a touchdown last week. Could be a bit touchdown dependent, and you see Doubs, Wicks, and Kraft. I'll talk about him in a second. A lot of good receiving options there. Maybe not great necessarily, and you can't maybe predict when that's going to happen. Not a great matchup in week 3, but I think Doubs is one who will get most of the volume, even if it's a negligible difference between him and the next one. Next up is Xavier Worthy. Not sure. They were hoping that he was going to be playing. I think regardless of if he is or not, Rashee Rice is still not back yet. And Tyquan Thornton, I think, is an interesting one to have. And I think, again, even if Worthy is playing, Thornton would be an interesting one to plug in there as the outside threat that can take the top off of defense. We're finally seeing Thornton kind of become what we were hoping he would have in New England. And, of course, that's with the legendary Patrick Mahomes throwing him the ball. And last but not least, wide receiver-wise, these are a couple names that are questionable, all of which I believe should play, but should be considered in terms of how healthy we actually think they are and their matchups and that sort of thing. So you got Ladd McConkey, Emeka Egbuka, Juwan Jennings, Darnell Mooney, and then Wan'Dale Robinson, all guys that have either done well for fantasy in one or both of the weeks thus far, or, say maybe like in Mooney's case, not necessarily done tremendously well from a fantasy points standpoint, but has earned a good snap share and did well last year. So the hope would be that he could rise back to that role. And last but not least, the tight end position. George Kittle, of course, we do already know that he is on the IR, and we've got a man with the last name of Tongues as his backup there, and Luke Farrell as well, I believe, is the other one that they've kind of split duties with. It's anyone's guess who's really going to get the work there. I think that's not really. I think for the tight end position, if you're not getting a couple of those top guys with the McBride, Kittle, I would say Bowers, but I know he's been injured, and Kraft would be another one, which I'll talk about in a second. Really, at that point, you just stream. You'll find somebody else on the waiver wire, what have you, that you can deal with. Kraft, as I just mentioned, added to the injury report. Not much is really out yet, but definitely get Luke Musgrave. And I know he's someone who has certainly taken a back seat to Kraft, and Kraft is definitively a better tight end and more dynamic weapon and fantasy relevant tight end. But Musgrave has still gotten some touches, even with a healthy Tucker Kraft. And I think, as we're talking with Jaden Reed out, I think you cannot discount what the tight end role means for Green Bay. And I think he's one that, God forbid, if Tucker Kraft has some sort of extended injury, and Musgrave is going to be one that's going to be rising to weekly top 15 upside, I would say. And the last two here, we got Brock Bowers and Tyler Warren. Two guys, both questionable. Bowers, of course, he was dealing with the injury even throughout the first 2 weeks and hasn't quite looked himself. The offense looks a bit different than I think we were expecting it to, certainly compared to what he did last year in his rookie season. But hoping for the best there. I do think he may underperform again this week. And Tyler Warren, of course, he's been a focal point of that Colts offense. Questionable, but believe he should play as far as we know as of this moment. So all in all, those are the Band-Aids. Those are the ones that, of course, waivers have already ran, so likely a lot of these guys have already been picked up, claimed, what have you, but hopefully you have a couple, and hopefully you are considering the length of these absences and what they actually mean when these players end up actually coming back and what roles are left for these fill-ins. So that is Band-Aids.
I'm going to flex and bust out of here.
Next up is Flex and Bust Out. This is looking at running backs and wide receivers outside of the top 36 per Fantasy Pros rankings. Just a way to kind of look at what does the consensus think and who are some guys that I think outside of that range, 3 for each, 3 running backs and 3 wide receivers, could actually climb into the top 36. Ideally, well into it, top 24 if it were up to me. And last week was a pretty good one, I would say. And this one is, I would say, a bit tougher. When I'm seeing some of these guys, these are some interesting ones, especially from the running back perspective. As I go for the first one here is Tyler Algier is the running back 38. Going up against the Panthers, again, as a Panthers fan, I don't know what to say. This has been a rough season already, and it's only about to be week 3. Tyler Algier had a increased role in week 2, and he's someone who, again, before Bijan was even there, Tyler Algier did put up a 1,000-yard season. I know that doesn't quite mean the same thing necessarily in the extended season to this point. I know Rico Dowdle's had that last season as well. But Algier, I think, is one of the best handcuffs to have when you look at what he could do to step into the Bijan role in this offense. Again, he is not Bijan. But if you think just simply with the opportunity that he would have to step into, there's not really much behind him. So you see him step into probably a similar opportunity share there. And I think against this Carolina Panthers defense, again, the Falcons defense is not too much to write home about, especially with a couple of injuries they recently had. So I think Algier is going to get some run behind Bijan, again, at best, 70-30 split with him. But Algier could very well vulture a touchdown against this hapless Carolina Panthers defense, and I like my chances. And next up is Rachaad White. He's the RB 40 on the week, going up against the Jets. So we saw last week him get a little more involved and, of course, vultured a touchdown, so took that away from Bucky Irving. Again, this is not a slight to Bucky Irving. Bucky's doing well. That Buccaneers offense is showing why they, as a whole, are the best team in that division. But Rachaad White is showing that regardless of Liam Cohen being there or not, I think you're seeing a similar kind of split in terms of this is definitely Bucky Irving's backfield, but Rachaad White has a definitive role in it on a week-to-week basis. You can't necessarily figure out if it's going to be more of a 60-40, 70-30 type split on a week-to-week basis, but you know that he's going to be involved. And again, like we saw in week 2, getting that touchdown was a huge boon for him and his fantasy points, and that's the hope of what we would see here against the Jets. And again, not something you can always plan, but something you can kind of shoot for as you're getting these slightly deeper flex plays here. And last but not least, I talked about him in the last segment there, is Kyle Monangai at running back 56 going up against the Cowboys. So as I mentioned, DeAndre Swift, questionable. Believe he's going to play. Everything should be fine. But we saw Monangai double or approximately double his snap share from week 1 to week 2. Of course, his touches increased as well. And I think that even his number of touches, considering his snap share, I think is notable as well. I think all of us were surprised as they went throughout the offseason for the Bears that they weren't bringing more to this backfield outside of DeAndre Swift. Of course, Roschon Johnson is already there, but a bit of an afterthought thus far, now that he is healthy. And Monangai, I think, is someone, especially in this matchup, it could very well turn into a ride the hot hand. I do still think Swift is going to get a bulk of the touches, but if Monangai gets in there for a couple of drives and at those right moments is able to bust off some runs and maybe even vulture a touchdown against a weak Cowboys defense, a Parsons-less Cowboys defense, that could be someone who is going to be jumping well ahead, so going from 56 to inside that top 36. And going over to the wide receivers, The first of which is Michael Pittman, wide receiver 37, going up against the Tennessee Titans. So, again, just outside of that top 36, literally one spot. But I think we're going to see Pittman get back to business here against the Titans. Again, not an atrocious defense by any means, but it's not the Broncos. And, again, the Colts are – that offense is firing on all cylinders. This is the best total offense I would say that Daniel Jones has had around him when it's including the offensive line, the strength of that, the running back, and his pass catchers. And I think what you're seeing is Michael Pittman finally getting the opportunity to elevate his role for fantasy to what I think matches his actual skills. He's someone who I think has always been underappreciated and underutilized, but finally getting the chance to shine, so to speak, and that is someone at the to the dismay of a Josh Downs, who is kind of, as you see Michael Pittman's role grow, you see Josh Downs' role decrease as Tyler Warren is stepping in and kind of taking a lot of that over the middle of the field work. But for this week, yeah, Michael Pittman, I see him sliding into the top 36. I do see maybe even a little bit beyond that. And second wide receiver, another veteran, but a little bit older, Cooper Kupp, wide receiver 48. They're going up against the Saints. We saw him get a bit more involved there in week 2, and I think it may not continue well beyond that, but I do think that the Seahawks definitely did not want to have to only be funneling, I forgot what the percentage was, the most of the yards going to Jackson Smith and Jigba in week 1. And being able to spread that out to Cooper Kupp as well, someone who is going to be on the field, and with that should get opportunities. New Orleans defense, not too strong, and Spencer Rattler has done well to keep them, somewhat in games as best he can. But if we're having this turn into any bit of a shootout, even though the Seattle Seahawks defense is relatively good, I think Kupp is going to be involved, and from a PPR standpoint, going to be someone who can climb into that top 36. And last but not least, I could have gone with either of the Titans receivers in this one, as Calvin Ridley was also ranked outside the 36, but I'm going to go a little bit more bold and go Alec Ayomanor, and he is the second wide receiver there, and he's wide receiver 55 on the week, going up against the Colts, like I said. Someone who, again, seeing him come into the league, just kind of felt like we've got another Gabe Davis, and I remember how people freaked out about Gabe Davis when he had his, as I call it, Gabe Davis playoff game where he just erupted. And I'm not saying that's exactly what's going to happen with Ayomanor. I think he's someone who actually has proved to be, again, only in 2 games, so small sample size, have a bit more stable of a role than that. I think how he wins is maybe why I was thinking that coming into the league. But as Cam Ward gets more comfortable, as he has some easier matchups than he had in the first 2 weeks, again, some tough ones for him, I think Ayomanor is going to be, it's already some good chemistry and someone who can win at the catch point, which is tremendously important. And as Calvin Ridley is dealing with the main focus of the defenses, I think it will allow Ayomanor to work one-on-one ideally and be able to also have that touchdown upside, as the Titans are, likely going to be working from behind. A team that not expected to win too many games this season, but hopefully for fantasy's sake, it will lead to some fantasy points for the rookie here. And that does it for Flex and Bust Out. Again, these are 6 players who, if you consider at this point, we're already past week 2 and there's injuries mounting, there's depth charts getting shuffled around. Look for some of these guys if you need a flex spot, depending on how deep your league is, depending on how many injuries you've got, and hopefully it will lead you to victory.
No this or that.
And last but not least, this or that. This is looking at 2 closely ranked players in Fantasy Pros ranks, and again, talking about the consensus there, and kind of picking between of which one I think is going to do better this week. And this week, actually, I did go for some that were maybe not as closely ranked and try to be a little bit bold with this one. Had a pretty good week last week on the picks, so I thought I'd make it difficult for myself on a couple of these. So if they sound crazy, they'll probably be wrong, so don't worry about it. So first up, going with a couple of quarterbacks here, we've got Daniel Jones, again, going up against the Titans, and Bo Nix going up against the Chargers. Of course, both good defenses. the Chargers, of course, shown to have been tremendous and better than the Titans defense. Nix had gotten off to a slow start, and Daniel Jones, of course, has found his home as Indiana Jones. So for me, I'm going Daniel Jones. I think that he's going to keep this up. I think he can, at worst, be in the high teens for fantasy points. And Nix, I think he's going to have some issues with that Chargers defense, but he's going to need to be throwing to keep up with an offense that has been very pass-heavy, even in neutral situations. And I think that's going to be interesting to see what mistakes are made there and how does that work fantasy-wise for Nix as a whole. And next up, the second quarterback matchup, I've got Carson Wentz going up against the Bengals and Trevor Lawrence going up against the Texans. This one, again, I think it's more just maybe the names are why I feel like this is a bit of a bold one that I'm saying, but I'm going Carson Wentz. I understand it's been a little while since he started, and this is a new team for him. Again, he did sign with his team just right before the season started, of course, after they traded Sam Howell away. Trevor Lawrence, he does have I think it was a QB 11 start on the week, and I think it was week 2. So again, for fantasy's sake, it's not like he's imploding, but the offense just doesn't look right, and has been a bit buoyed, the offense as a whole, by the rushing attack, which I do expect to still do pretty well. Going up against the Texans, not an easy matchup, and Carson Wentz, I think he's going to be able to unlock this offense a bit, and some of these pass catchers, again, Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, that sort of thing, I think they're going to finally be well utilized as they should for the top tier talents that they are. Next, hitting the running backs, we've got Jonathan Taylor going up against the Titans, of course, as we know from Daniel Jones, and we've got Bijan Robinson going up against the Carolina Panthers. Again, a lot of continuity here in all these segments, talking about some of the same matchups and same teams. I'm going with Jonathan Taylor on this one. He just had a tremendously strong week in week 2, and I do think that the Colts offense is going to continue to be humming along. The only surprise for this one is, of course, the Carolina Panthers defense is rough, and I do think Bijan's going to get some good work there. But I do think Jonathan Taylor is going to help take over against the Titans defense, both on the ground through the air. Bijan will do a bit of the same, but I do think there's going to be a bit more of a split going between he and Algier, and I think they're going to try and spread that around as the Panthers defense is vulnerable, but I think they're going to be going through a bit of a shootout as much as they can, even though the Falcons defense maybe is not what the Cardinals is last week in terms of just mismanagement and that sort of thing. And after that, going to this one, just for namesake, I think is a bit shocking to hear, but I think when you see how they've played, I think it's a bit understanding. Jaylen Warren going up against the New England Patriots, and Breece Hall going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I'm going Jaylen Warren on this one. It's a bit shocking to see how it's gone for Breece Hall thus far, and I do still think it's his backfield in New York, but you've got Tyrod Taylor, of course, stepping in, and curious to see what that means for Breece Hall in the rushing attack as a whole. But again, Jaylen Warren, I was a bit uneasy to see how much of this backfield was going to be his, and it is securely his backfield. They trust him. Aaron Rodgers, of course, fell very, very quickly back to earth in week 2, but Warren still had his steady role. He is trusted in pass pro, and I think he's someone who can perform pretty well and surprisingly better than Breece Hall here in week 2. Going to the wide receivers, got Rome Odunze going up against the Dallas Cowboys and Brian Thomas Jr. going up against the Houston Texans. Again, another one that's mentioning the same matchup as I just talked about Trevor Lawrence. Brian Thomas Jr., again, it's not that the targets haven't been there. There's been some talk of an injury that kind of popped up after week 2, which they said he'd been dealing with. I guess that's to say he's been dealing with it the entire time. But again, just feeling really uneasy about the Jaguars offense. And I mean, Brian Thomas Jr. is the target leader, and he is the number 1 target for that offense. But that's going to be a tough matchup. Rome Odunze coming off of a booming week in week 2. And Cowboys defense that is just, it's not what it used to be. Some of it's injuries, some of it's that Micah Parsons is gone. Regardless, the Bears are going up against the Dallas Cowboys offense that is going to be clipping along, so they're going to need to keep up. And I do think that Rome Odunze is going to be a big piece of that, at least 1 touchdown and a big old chunk of yardage. So he is someone who I think is going to maybe not do as well as he did last week, but do on par or better with week 1. And the second matchup here, we got Tetairoa McMillan going up against the Atlanta Falcons and Emeka Egbuka going up against the New York Jets. Again, two ones that I kind of already talked about a little bit in terms of matchup. But Tetairoa McMillan, he is the clear lone bright spot with whatever nonsense is happening with the Panthers and going up against a injury-riddled secondary in the Falcons. I trust him to go ahead and beat out his fellow rookie, Emeka Egbuka, with the Buccaneers. Egbuka, who is questionable, but I believe should play as far as I know. Egbuka has been buoyed by some touchdowns to this point, but again, has played tremendously well, and curious to see what happens when Godwin comes back from his injury. But Tetairoa McMillan, I do think, is going to be the one there, and no surprise, he is the wide receiver 1 in that offense, so looking forward to how that grows over the coming years. And last but not least, the tight end position, 2 matchups here. Juwan Johnson going up against the Seattle Seahawks and Sam Laporta going up against the Baltimore Ravens. Again, this is probably just an interesting one for namesake, but going Juwan Johnson here, Sam Laporta, we saw the Detroit Lions offense kind of come back alive here in week 2 and just whooped the Bears. But now they're going up against the Ravens, and I expect a little bit different of a story there. And as I mentioned, Seattle Seahawks defense, no slouches necessarily, but Juwan Johnson has clearly carved out a significant role there. And again, there's still not much competition, certainly in the tight end room. But from a receiving standpoint, again, I understand Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, but Juwan Johnson will still continue to have a role there. And he is one who I think is a perennial top 12 option, barring some wild things happening there. And last but not least, possibly my biggest and most noteworthy selection this week, TJ Hawkinson going up against the Cincinnati Bengals, and I've got him beating Brock Bowers going up against the Washington Commanders. Bowers has not quite looked himself, and also just the Raiders' offense has not fed him in the same way that they had before. Bowers, of course, questionable to this point, so I'm saying this assuming Bowers plays. Of course, Hawkinson's going to beat him if Bowers doesn't play. But I really think that this Minnesota Vikings offense, again, as I've said a couple of times at this point, is going to be clipping along through the air. It's going to be what they had hoped for with J.J. McCarthy. And considering the mystery of his injury, him going out, and then if Wentz does indeed step in and show his veteran presence and his ability to push the ball downfield, if he's maximizing the weapons that are around him, that makes it a very uncomfortable decision for Kevin O'Connell in terms of, does McCarthy go back in, or do you try to actually win out and do that instead of developing, quote-unquote, the now second-year guy in J.J. McCarthy. So I'm very interested to see what happens with that, and very optimistic for the Minnesota Vikings. But with that being said, that does it for this week's episode, and hopefully that all you out there that are dealing with the injuries and that sort of thing, you find a little bit of help with the waiver wire that's already ran, of course, and hopefully with some of these flex options that I noted, you're able to go ahead and get a third win. Or if you're shooting for your first, I know we're getting closer and closer to the point where certainly in Dynasty, if you're winless, certainly after week 3, you consider tearing it down. So hoping for a win for everybody, and thank you for tuning in. Please be sure to subscribe to the Faux Football Substack and the podcast, both of which are at fatherdynasty.com, or certainly for the podcast, if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcast, go ahead and check it out there. And for any of your tremendous feedback on this podcast or anything on the Substack, you know where to find me on Twitter at FatherDynasty. So everyone have a great week 3.